acts that might be described as terrorism are as old as the recorded history of warfare. Terrorism, as we know it today, however, is really a recent mode of violence and challenges traditional notions of international policy and warfare. I will describe these challenges in the next few episodes of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, Colonel, U.S. Cavalry retired. This series explains the enduring philosophy of war, as it was, as it is, and will continue to be, regardless of advances in weaponry or politics. For more than 2 decades, the United States has been prosecuting a so-called war on terrorism. Now, this war nearly spanned the spectrum of military operations, from large-scale combat in the early months of our war in Afghanistan to targeted killing of individuals identified as members of one of the 81 entities designated as foreign terrorist organizations under U.S. law. More recently, the United States attacked and sank a boat carrying an impressive amount of narcotics, killing all aboard. The rationale for this action was that these persons and their cargo were part of one of these declared terrorist organizations. But what makes a terrorist organization, and what precepts of national or international law allows a government to attack such persons with lethal force normally reserved for armed conflict? Now, this is going to take several episodes to unravel, and quite honestly, I'm still in the process of unraveling it myself. I'll begin in this episode of trying to define the concept of terrorism. So, what is terrorism? Maybe it will surprise you, or maybe it won't, that there is no single internationally recognized definition of terrorism. For those who have followed this podcast, you may remember that there's no single internationally recognized definition for private military and security company, and the definition of mercenary is similarly problematic. It can become more confusing as legal systems differentiate between domestic and international terrorism. Now, since this series is about the philosophy of war, I'll focus on international terrorism. So I will tee up some relevant definitions we can work from. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, while admitting that terrorism has no universally agreed definition, describes terrorism as, quote, a method of coercion that utilizes or threatens to utilize violence in order to spread fear and thereby attain political or ideological goals, unquote. The United Kingdom's Crown Prosecutor's Office defines terrorism as, quote, the use or threat of serious violence to persons, property damage, endangering life, serious risks to health or safety, or disrupting electronic systems designed to influence the government or an international government organization, or to intimidate the public. This use or threat must also be for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. So far, not too different from the UNODC definition, but they try to go into a little bit more specific detail. But then the Crown Prosecutor's Office goes on to state, quote, if this threat or action involves the use of firearms or explosives, it is terrorism, regardless of whether or not the action is designed to influence the government or an international government organization, or to intimidate the public or section of the public. This seems to me to be a very strange addition, as any murder using a firearm or an act of arson could then be charged as terrorism. If everything is terrorism, nothing is. But the British definition gets even better. Planning, assisting, and even collecting information on how to commit terrorist acts are all crimes under the British terrorism legislation. If, therefore, you happen to have a copy of the Anarchist's Handbook, or Abbie Hoffman's Steal This Book, both of which were quite popular when I was in my 20s, or various doctrinal publications intended for special operations forces, you could be charged as a terrorist for collecting information on how to commit terrorist acts. Lewis Carroll's character Humpty Dumpty would be proud of this definition, because you can make it mean whatever you want it to mean. In the United States, the FBI describes terrorism as, quote, the unlawful use or threat of violence to create fear with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or government to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. Now, this is expanded in a legal definition, which of course is much more complex. In this case, it's Title 18 U.S. Code Chapter 113B, which is conveniently titled Terrorism. It defines, quote, international terrorism, unquote, as activities that, involve violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, or that would be a criminal violation if committed within the jurisdiction of the United States or of any states, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States or transcend international boundaries. The Department of Defense Law of War Manual describes terrorism as the unauthorized use of violence by private persons to achieve political ends. Now, I find this one-line description interesting because it's the mirror image of the German political theorist Max Weber's notion of the government's monopoly on violence, which I described in a previous episode. Weber described a state as, quote, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory, unquote. A few lines later, Weber wrote, quote, the state is considered the sole source of the right to use violence. Now, this concept is often used by academic opponents to private military and security companies, saying that PMSCs usurp the sole prerogative of a state to use coercive force. Now, this argument misses a line in between the two sentences which I just read, which reads, the right to use violence is ascribed to other institutions or to individuals only to the extent to which a state permits it. This then legitimizes PMSC so long as they abide by state license and state promulgated rules for the use of force. Pertinent to the description of terrorism, however, both Weber and the Department of Defense descriptions call out the unauthorized use of violence. Use of violence not allowed by the state could therefore be considered terrorism. I will build on this idea in the next podcast describing the history and development of terrorism. In the modern context of terrorism, however, the DoD definition expands on the unauthorized use of violence by specifying that this violence intends to spread terror among the civilian population. Although this may surprise many people, this means that the U.S. Department of Defense definition and the United Nations definitions are almost interchangeable. Legal definitions, such as the Crown Prosecutor's Office and U.S. public law, are important when it comes to bringing terrorists to justice. For understanding how terrorism interacts with the philosophy of war, we need something simpler than a legal prescription. Going back to Clausewitz's description of war as an act of violence intended to compel our enemy to do our will, and Weber's description of the monopoly of violence, it seems that terrorism differs only in whether that use of force and violence is unauthorized by the state, or more specifically, unlawful according to relevant national and international law. This podcast series, therefore, will draw from both the DoD and UNODC definitions to describe terrorism as unlawful violent acts or credible threats of violence by non-governmental actors directed against the civilian population to spread fear and coerce the civilian population or targeted government to achieve political ends. By specifying non-governmental actors, I don't mean that violence against the civilian population by governments is permissible. It's not. It's a grave violation of the laws and customs of war and just war theory. It's just not terrorism. In the next episode, I'll describe the history of terrorism, showing that although the basic concept is ancient, the complete definition describing contemporary terrorism is really something new.